The winter of 1907 came hard to the West Fork River Valley. On the morning of December 6th, in the coal camp of Monongah, West Virginia, the ground itself was frozen, and men and boys walked in the dark toward the mouths of two mines cut into the hillside. The Fairmont Coal Company's number 6 and number 8, among the most productive shafts in the northern coal fields. They carried open flame lamps and tin pails. Some were grown men with families waiting in the company houses below. Some were children, 10 and 11 years old, small enough to slip into spaces a man could not reach. None of them knew that most of them would not come back up. At roughly 10:20 in the morning, the mountain exploded. The blast tore through the connected tunnels of number 6 and number 8 with a force that shattered windows, knocked streetcars off their rails, and threw debris across the valley. People later swore they felt it 8 miles away. The explosion destroyed the ventilation system in an instant, and that detail, mundane, mechanical, is what turned a disaster into a mass grave. The men who survived the initial fire did not survive what came after. The mine filled with poisonous gas, and in the impenetrable dark, one by one, they suffocated. 4 Italian miners escaped. 1 Polish miner was pulled out alive. Nearly everyone else who had been underground that morning died. The official death toll was recorded as 361, later placed at 362s, but that number was contested from the very first day, and it still is. Record keeping in the camps was careless, and the workforce was full of men whose names appeared on no ledger. Immigrants hired by the shift, and boys brought below by their fathers to earn a wage that was never written down. Some local accounts and several newspapers at the time put the true figure above 400, and modern estimates have reached beyond 500. The honest answer, more than a century later, is that no one knows exactly how many men and boys died inside that hill. What is certain is who they were. Of the recorded dead, 171 were Italian immigrants. The rest were a cross-section of the labor that built the American coal economy. 85 American-born, 52 Hungarians, 31 Russians, 15 Austrians, a handful of Turks and others from the fading edges of Austria-Hungary. They had been drawn to Monongah by the same promise that drew everyone to the camps: steady work, a company house, a way to feed children through a mountain winter. Since 1883, when the railroads opened the untapped coal fields of West Virginia, new towns had sprung up almost overnight, and European immigrants and black families from the South had poured into the mountains chasing a livelihood from coal. The company town was the whole world. The company owned the houses they slept in, the store where they bought their food, often the school and the church. A man's wage frequently came not as money, but as scrip, company currency, good only at the company store. To work in Monongah was to live inside the company's grip completely, and on that December morning, that grip closed. The arithmetic of grief was staggering. The disaster left roughly 250 women widowed in a single morning. It left hundreds of children without fathers. Later studies count at least 475, with more than 30 born to widows in the months after, and some accounts of extended families reach 1,000 orphans. In a town of a few thousand people, nearly every household was touched. There were not enough coffins. There were not enough graves dug in frozen ground. And when the inquest came, the record produced one of the coldest sentences in American labor history. A coroner's jury examined the deaths of A.H. Morris, Charlie McCain, John M. McGraw, and roughly 350 others, and concluded that the traces of gas had been slight and not considered dangerous, and that in operating these mines, the company complied with the mining laws of the state. No one was held responsible. Legally, no one had done anything wrong, because in West Virginia, in 1907, there was almost no law to break. Nationwide that year, 3,242 Americans were killed in the mines, and West Virginia carried the highest death rate of any coal state in the country. That is the entry point into the world of the forgotten people. Not a battlefield, not a plague, a hillside in Appalachia where the price of coal was written in the bodies of immigrants and children, and where the men who profited walked away, found blameless by the very laws they had helped keep weak. The outrage that followed Monongah, joined to disaster after disaster in the same brutal year, would eventually force Congress to act. But that reckoning came later. First came the daily suffering that the coal camps had already made ordinary. The suffering that did not explode, but ground people down one shift at a time. To understand what died at Monongah, you have to understand what the living had already endured before the blast. The men who walked into numbers 6 and 8 were not soldiers or adventurers. They were laborers who had traded the poverty of southern Italy, or the villages of Austria, Hungary, for the poverty of an American coal camp, and the work they did was among the most brutal and least regulated in the country. The Monongah mines worked a thick coal seam and ran almost around the clock on 2 long shifts. A miner spent his day bent double or on his knees in a space sometimes barely 5 feet high, swinging a pick by the light of a single open flame fixed to his cap. He breathed air thick with coal dust and blasting smoke. He undercut the coal by hand, set his own charges of black powder, and loaded the broken coal into wooden cars pulled by mules through the dark. He was paid not by the hour but by the ton, which meant every load that a company check weighman marked light was money stolen from a family's table. And the miner did not work alone. The mines ran on the labor of boys. In West Virginia's mines, a child might start at 8 or 10 as a trapper, a door boy, sitting alone in total darkness for 10 hours a day beside a wooden ventilation door, waiting for the rumble of a coal car so he could open it and close it again. The photographer Lewis Hine, documenting these mines the year after Monongah, found trapper boys earning 75 cents for a 10-hour day, their only task to open and shut a door in the black. Others worked as brake boys, tipple boys, and mule drivers, riding coal cars beneath live electric wires strung shoulder high. Boys had their legs crushed by the cars. Boys breathed the same killing dust as their fathers, and the black lung that came from it did not care how young the lungs were. Above ground, the suffering was quieter but constant. The company house was a rough wooden box, cold in the mountain winter, its walls thin against the wind that howled down the hollows. The company store stood near the railroad tracks at the center of every camp. And it was more than a store. It was the mechanism of control, because miners were often paid in scrip rather than cash, and because that scrip was good only at the company store, a family could be bound to the company by debt before it ever saw $1. Prices were what the company set. A man could work a full shift and still owe more than he earned, and the debt followed him. This was the web in which many miners were caught. The 16 tons arithmetic of a life mortgaged to the same company that owned the mine that might kill you. Hunger was managed, not banished. A family ate what the company store sold on company terms. Cold was endured. Disease moved easily through the crowded camps. The same crowding that made the camps profitable made them sick. And underlying all of it was the constant low hum of danger. Nationwide in 1907, more than 3,000 miners were killed. West Virginia led the nation in the rate at which it buried its own. Explosions, roof falls, gas, runaway cars. The mine took men steadily, in 1s and 2s, long before it took 360 in a morning. The particular horror of Monongah's numbers, 6 and 8, was built into their design. The 2 mines were connected underground, so that when one exploded, there was nothing to stop the blast and the gas from rolling into the other. And the ventilation system, the fans and doors that push breathable air through miles of tunnel, was the first thing the explosion destroyed. In a mine, ventilation is not a comfort. It is the difference between air and afterdamp, the poison mixture of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide that settles after a coal mine explosion. When the fans died, the mine began to fill with a gas that kills silently. The men who were not burned or crushed by the first blast were sealed inside a space that was slowly turning against their lungs. Rescue was almost impossible. There was no federal mine rescue apparatus in 1907, no self-contained breathing gear in the hands of ordinary crews, no Bureau of Mines. It did not yet exist. Rescuers could work only in short, desperate stretches before the gas drove them back. They tunneled toward men they could not reach in time. For days, the town waited at the mine mouth while the recovery crawled forward through poison and rubble, and the arithmetic of the dead climbed higher with each body carried out. The suffering of Monongah was not only the suffering of one morning, it was the suffering of a system that had made that morning inevitable and had made the men and boys inside it cheap. When the fires burned down and the gas cleared enough for the recovery to begin, a second horror opened, one that lasted far longer than the explosion and left deeper wounds in the survivors than the blast itself. The bodies could not simply be recovered. The force of the explosion had been so violent that many of the dead were torn apart, and the gas and fire had done the rest. Of the men and boys underground, only a fraction were brought out whole enough to be seen as men. Perhaps 97 bodies were recovered near the mine entrances, and of those only about 52 could be identified at all. By scraps of clothing, by a pocket watch, by a tool, by dental work. Child victims were the hardest of all to identify, small and burned and nameless in the chaos. Miners had carried tin identification tags into the mine, but for the boys and the unregistered immigrant laborers, the very men who most needed counting, the tags meant nothing, because those men had often taken pains not to be counted so that they could get the work. What followed was, in the words of later scholars, a covert and hurried recovery. Embalmers set up along the main street of Monongah and worked around the clock. Coffins lined both sides of the road and filled the church grounds. Photographs from those days show rows of caskets stretching down the street and work crews digging grave after grave on the hill above the ethnic cemeteries. Because so many of the dead were Italian, Hungarian, and Polish Catholics, the Catholic cemetery filled quickly, and the Fairmont Coal Company gave an acre of land for a new one. There, 135 unidentified victims were buried together in a single mass grave, men whose families would never know which mound of earth held their husband, their father, their son. Bodies were assembled from pieces. Names were assigned to remains that could not be truly named. For a widow, the ordinary rituals of grief, to see the face, to bury the man, to know, were quietly denied. This was the systemic cruelty beneath the physical one. The machinery that processed the dead treated them as a problem of administration, not as people. The recovery was managed to move the town back to work. The relief was managed to keep order, and the women who bore the brunt of it, mostly immigrant widows, many of whom spoke little English, were consulted about none of it. Later, historians who returned to the relief records found those women patronized in the reports, mocked for their grief at the graveside, described in cold and ethnocentric terms by the officials who were meant to help them. Their names went unrecorded, their experiences went unexplored for the better part of a century. Then came the inquest, and with it, the final erasure. The coroner's jury heard the evidence and delivered its verdict. The gas had been slight and not considered dangerous. The company had complied with the mining laws of the state. The cause was ruled a blown-out shot, or the ignition of powder. An accident, no one's fault. The design that connected the two mines so a single blast could roll through both, the ventilation that failed instantly, the boys sent underground, the immigrants uncounted. None of it was a crime because the law had been written thin enough that none of it needed to be. The company that owned the mine, the houses, the store, and the scrip was found to owe the dead nothing but charity. And charity is what arrived, carefully rationed. A Monongah Mines Relief Committee formed within days. Andrew Carnegie's foundation contributed tens of thousands of dollars. Some 2,000 American newspapers promoted a national fundraiser that ultimately gathered around $150,000. The Red Cross came too. Its work at Monongah, led in part by the investigator Margaret Byington, was one of the first times the organization managed the aftermath of a man-made American disaster, and it reshaped how the Red Cross would respond to catastrophes for decades. But the relief, however well-meaning, was administered from above and doled out by formula. In the end, each widow received roughly $200 and about $155 for each child under 16, a fixed sum against the loss of a lifetime's wages, handed to families who had no say in how it was measured. The company store still stood. The scrip still spent only there. A widow with children and no husband's wage now faced the same closed economy that had bound her family in the first place, only now without the man whose labor had been its only currency. The system that had produced the disaster remained perfectly intact. The dead were buried, the mines were bricked up, and the coal, after a pause for grief, began to move again. The deepest suffering of Monongah was not that men died, it was that everything which killed them was found to be entirely, unbearably legal. In the end, the weight of Monongah fell hardest on those least able to carry it, the boys who died in the dark, and the women and children who had to go on living in the camp the disaster left behind. Among the dead were children who should never have been underground at all, boys of 10 and 11 who had gone in beside their fathers, small hands that had trapped doors and picked slate and steadied mules, ended in an instant. They were among the hardest to identify and the easiest to forget, and many of them lie today in that acre of unmarked ground, counted, if they were counted at all, only as part of a number that the record itself admits is wrong. The suffering of the coal camps had always concentrated in its children. Lewis Hines' photographs from these same West Virginia mines show the faces of trapper boys and tipple boys smudged with coal, hands cut and bruised, some already carrying the asthma and black lung that would shorten their lives. Monongah simply killed in a morning what the mines would otherwise have taken slowly. For the living, the reckoning stretched across decades. 250 widows, hundreds of fatherless children, some families with no breadwinner and no way home to the villages they had left. One of them has become the enduring face of that grief. Caterina Davia, an Italian widow whose husband was among the men entombed in the mine, left alone with 4 children. For 29 years afterward, it is said, she walked nearly a mile to the mine each day, gathered a sack of coal, and emptied it onto a mound beside her home. A private, wordless act of mourning kept up for almost 3 decades. One woman's monument to a man the record could not even hand back to her. A century later, a statue of the heroine of Monongah would be raised in her image, dedicated to all the widows and orphans. But that recognition took 100 years to come. For most of the 20th century, Monongah was barely remembered outside the valley. The first memorial did not appear until 1961. A state historical marker followed in 1963. It was not until the centenary in 2007 that the disaster received its first major public reckoning. A bell sent from the Italian region of Molise, now standing in the Monongah town square, and in 2009, an honor conferred on the victims by the President of Italy. The men and boys had waited 100 years to be named as more than a statistic. Yet Monongah did not vanish without changing the country that produced it. The scale of the horror, joined to a catalog of other 1907 disasters in a year that killed more than 3,000 American miners, forced a nation that had looked away to look. Out of that pressure, in 1910, Congress created the United States Bureau of Mines, the first federal body charged with investigating mines and reducing the slaughter underground. It was late, and it was partial, and the coal camp's deeper injustices, the scrip, the compulsory company store, the child labor, would not be broken until the labor struggles and New Deal reforms of the following decades, when compulsory scrip wages were abolished and no one under 17 was allowed to work in or around the mines. The dead of Monongah did not live to see it, but the first flicker of a federal conscience about the men who dug the nation's coal was lit, in part, by their bodies. This is what the hidden mountains of Appalachia hold. Not one tragedy, but a pattern. A place rich beyond measure in the coal that powered a rising industrial nation, whose wealth flowed out to distant cities and whose costs stayed behind in the valley. In company graveyards, in widows gathering coal, in boys who never grew old. The forgotten people of Monongah were forgotten not by accident, but by design, because a system that measured a man in tons could not afford to remember him as a father. Their suffering was ordinary in its time. That is the hardest truth of all. A civilization that could feel the blast 8 miles away chose for 100 years not to hear it. The mountains remembered, and now, at last, so must we.